and I also hope this video helps the opposition abandon this dead-end argument of theirs and helps them join us here in the 21st century, where they, not the Thai military and monarchy, are the chief benefactors of US funding and interference. There's a persistent myth that it was the US who built Thailand's monarchy back into a respected and revered institution after the 1932 coup ended absolute monarchy in the kingdom. It's claimed that it was part of the US attempts to win the Vietnam War and defeat communism in Southeast Asia. Of course, the US lost its war to Vietnam and shortly thereafter left Thailand. Thailand, despite hosting US forces between 1961 and 1975, had beforehand and ever since worked hard to build constructive ties with all nations in the region, especially China. Today, Thailand counts China as its largest trade partner, its largest foreign investor, its largest source of tourism, with more tourists arriving from China each year than from all Western nations combined. China is the chief supplier of military hardware to Thailand's armed forces and a close partner in building major infrastructure projects in the kingdom. This includes high-speed rail that will connect Thailand to China via Laos. But we're still going to hear very often how Thailand and its government, its military and monarchy are still somehow close allies of the US even today, and that the military and monarchy in particular owe their current existence to US support. But this is simply not true, and those making these claims in their own academic papers even prove it, and I'm going to show you exactly how that is. This myth ironically originates from today's US-backed Thai opposition itself, who has built this myth up over several decades, and you're going to hear many different versions of it. A recent op-ed titled "Thai Protesters Do Not Need US Support" from opposition media site Thai Inquirer would cite this myth in an attempt to deflect growing attention away from US support for today's ongoing anti-government protesters. Their article claims, beyond US support for Thailand's dictators is the well-documented US support for Thailand's monarchy, which Assistant Professor Pimason Michael Ratanasangchan calls the unshakable military king alliance. Thai Inquirer is trying to claim the US had supported the Thai military and monarchy in the past and implies they are still supporting the two institutions today. And this narrative is based on claims made about the 1932 coup, which ended absolute monarchy in Thailand, as well as claims made regarding the US military presence in Thailand during the Vietnam War. Thai Inquirer also cites a 1957 CIA document presenting it as proof that the US controlled Thailand's institutions. Yet if you actually read the document, it says very clearly that we believe Thailand's leaders will continue to modify their past policy of unequivocal alignment with the US and will probably seek to develop a more flexible foreign policy, particularly in respect to relations with Communist China. This was in 1957. This balancing act the CIA in the 1950s is talking about is something Thailand has done to preserve its sovereignty and to avoid Western colonization for centuries. It is a balancing act Thailand still plays today, and it has been Thailand's kings throughout history who have been the primary champions of this effective and admittedly nuanced policy. But the crux of Thai Inquirer's argument comes from a paper titled Thailand's Second Triumvirate, where its author Pimason connects Thailand's military leaders, King Rama IX, and the US all together in a single block of political power. I think it's the perfect paper to look at because it does such a good job lumping together several other inaccurate claims made by other so-called academics like Paul Chambers, Paul Handley, Duncan McCargo, and Chris Baker, who over the years have each taken turns trying to rewrite Thailand's history to suit the opposition's political agenda. And their claims are readily and uncritically repeated by the enemies of Thailand as a fact, including by the Thai Inquirer in this recent op-ed. But this paper contradicts itself all throughout, claiming in one paragraph how powerless Thailand's royalists were, then in the next paragraph admitting to the large business interests they controlled, the political and social clout they had, their role in the government even after the 1932 coup, and their ability to independently organize nationwide campaigns to restore their power even after the 1932 coup. For instance, the paper claims members of the 1932 coup group had been educated in the West and wanted a more modern government based on a constitution and a weak monarch. However, getting rid of the royal institution was not simple. The 1932 coup group could not legitimize their new government by offering the Thai people a constitution because it was a foreign concept to the people of Thailand. Thus, the 1932 coup leaders kept the king on the throne as their source of legitimacy. So, right here, even after overthrowing the absolute monarchy, the paper admits just how powerful the monarchy still was, how popular it was among Thai people, to the point where the coup makers were required to preserve the throne. The paper also at one point admits that even after the coup, a large number of royalists were still involved in the Thai government. A counter-coup the following year, in 1933, even though it failed, demonstrated that in addition to political and social support across Thai society, the Thai monarchy also still had large numbers of loyalists within the Thai military itself. While the paper claims the monarchy laid dormant until the 1950s, it's very obvious Thailand's royalists were simply waiting for the right time to re-emerge and restore Thailand. The paper admits to the large network Thai royalists used when this process finally began. It claims King Bhumibol's supporting cast consisted of the Privy Council, his personal staff, and a cache of princes. They filled his schedule with meetings with foreign dignitaries, royal ceremonies, charity programs, and religious activities. Princes with business and social connections promoted the king's image throughout the country. In other words, those loyal to Thailand's sovereign institutions had their own base of power, their own contacts, their own advisors, and their own ability to retake the country back from the Western-backed coup makers of 1932. They had the ability to do this, and that is exactly what they did. They did not need the US's help to do it. Now, the paper claims that the US CIA carried out PR campaigns to promote the Thai monarchy as well, which may or may not be true. But it's just like the US does everywhere. It cynically injects itself into a nation's internal affairs, and its so-called support may or may not make any difference at all. For terribly unpopular or weak movements, no amount of support from the US will make a difference. A good example of this is how the US dumped many times more resources into the South Vietnamese government. The US even militarily intervened on its behalf, and that obviously didn't make any difference at all. So from the 1932 coup to efforts by King Rama IX to restore Thailand as truly Thai, the paper itself admits the support of ordinary Thai people as key to the obvious success that resulted. It's a success that would have been achieved with or without US help, with no evidence at all provided to suggest US support was pivotal or even effective at all. Thailand's success in preserving its sovereign institutions is a success that endures until today, long after the US left Thailand. The idea that the US restored Thailand's monarchy to its current state of popularity simply doesn't add up. Neither do claims that the US somehow helped weld the Thai monarchy and military into a military-monarchy alliance. It makes no sense because over the centuries, the Thai monarchy already played a central role in the kingdom's defenses, and at times even led forces into battle and engaged in combat. It's a tradition that stretches from famous battles like that of King Na Re Suan 500 years ago to today's Thai king, King Rama X. The Royal Thai Army, as it exists today, is rooted in reforms undertaken by King Rama IV in the mid-1800s when the kingdom's first standing army was created. From his successor, King Rama V, to present day under King Rama X, Thailand's king has also held the title Supreme Head of the Army. The US had nothing to do with any of this. So before and after the 1932 coup, Thailand's monarchy has always had close ties to the Thai military and an obvious amount of influence over it. Which head of state from around the world doesn't? The myth that Thailand's monarchy needed America's help to weld it to the military and thus imbue it with real power is just that, a myth. The wealth, influence, and public support gathered together by a dynasty nearly 240 years old, built on top of an institution nearly 800 years old, doesn't just disappear overnight, and certainly doesn't need the US to help it continue, serving as a unifying force within Thai society. The US undoubtedly tried to exploit any internal conflict Thailand may have had last century, and even created new conflicts to leverage over Thailand. But one thing is for sure, the US is not responsible for the power, influence, and respect given to an institution that existed before the US was even a nation, and a dynasty nearly as old as the US itself. The US understood very well how important the Thai monarchy was, and the respect Thai people had for it. That's why they attempted to exploit it for their own agenda. And that's why now they and the fronts they fund are trying to attack and undermine the Thai monarchy today, specifically because they know how much of a unifying force the Thai monarchy is, and that no attempt at controlling Thailand can be successful unless the monarchy is weakened or removed first. The ultimate irony is that while the US maintained military forces in Thailand from 1961 to 1975, about 14 years, the US government from 2004 to present day has been funding anti-government and anti-monarchy fronts like Project Thai much longer. In fact, the US government openly funds virtually every core opposition group in Thailand today attempting to attack, undermine, and overthrow the Thai monarchy. And far from sifting through ambiguous documents from last century to prove this, all we have to do is go to the US government's own National Endowment for Democracy website and see all of these organizations in Thailand listed by name, together with dollar amounts of money they receive each year from the US government to undermine and divide Thailand.